So I just want you to start listing a couple places you can think of that you find water in the body. And I want you to think about and discuss how the water actually got there, because a lot of what we're going to be talking about as we think about physiology is how water and other substances are moving through the body and what that does for us. An easy question for those of you read ahead, but does anybody want to share a little bit of their discussion? Does someone want to tell me one of the places you thought you would find water in the body? And if you want to take a stab at where that water came from, I'd like to hear that too.
Well, there's water in your bladder, in your urine, which came from drinking it and going through your digestive system.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good place. And we'll see as we go through today's lecture, but also as we go through the systems, that drinking, of course, is how we get water initially into the body. And then we'll be seeing how the gastrointestinal tract and the circulatory system provide that water to different components of the body and different organ systems. So we're going to start out today by talking about some really broad different compartments in the body that are going to have slightly different composition. And these are the different compartments we're going to be thinking about water and solutes moving between as we progress through this course. I'm going to pull up the slides again. Okay. So we're starting by talking about a simplified body plan, which hopefully you guys were all thinking about yesterday, as that was the question we left off with at the end of Wednesday. And we're going to start talking about homeostasis, so how the body maintains its internal conditions, because that's really what your various organ systems are doing. That's their main job, is to keep internal conditions consistent in the body. So our lecture objectives today are to describe the distribution of water in the body, so the various places we'll find water, a little bit about the differences of the water in those places. We're going to talk about homeostasis and its significance to how the body works, and we're going to talk about feedback loops. So we're going to see that something called negative feedback is how the body controls its internal conditions. So when we're looking at the body, when we're thinking like physiologists, it's not helpful to draw out every single structure in the body. I love to do that as an anatomist, but as you'll see in anatomy lab, there are a lot of different parts of the body. And we can group them into some pretty basic groups, some different types of tissues that all function the same. But one of the key ways we want to think about the body really is where we have borders. We want to think about different fluid compartments, so different parts of the body that share fluid of similar composition. And we also want to be able to visualize where the outside of the body is, where the external environment is, and how that external environment differs from the internal environment. So this is a really simplified body plan. You can see it's basically just a square. A human being is not a square, but that's okay. That's actually helpful because it doesn't overwhelm us. So it's missing a lot of parts. It doesn't have all the different cell types because they're going to be functioning pretty similarly in terms of maintaining homeostasis. We're just trying to visualize some really key relationships about how things get into the body and how things get out of the body. So one of the key things we can see here, so as Kat shared with us, we have our nutrients and water going through the body. So that is one of the really important components of our simplified body plan. And so we can see that there's basically a tube through this whole system. So this is things coming through your mouth and then getting excreted, right? What we can see is that there's communication here between the inside of that gut tube, that lumen. So the lumen is the space inside the gut tube. So we can see that things move into the rest of the cells of the body through absorption. So AB, absorption. And the body also secretes things So secretion moves things from inside the body, and especially inside the bloodstream, back into that gut tube to get excreted as waste. So one of the key things we're thinking about as we look at this simplified body plan is we're thinking about how things are moving across different membranes. So in your previous classes, you've all talked about cells. So we've thought about cell membranes and how things cross a cell membrane. One of the things we want to keep in mind and think about as we're thinking about physiology, we're thinking about the human body. So we want to think of another membrane, a more specific membrane, which is our epithelial membrane. So you can see in this schematic drawing, we have cells all the way along the edge. So we have our epithelial layer. We can see that it even dives down somewhere we would consider in the body, right? We see this epithelial layer in the lining of the lungs. We see it lining the gut tube, and we see it lining what we think of in day-to-day life as the outside of the body as well. So this barrier really lines everything that's continuous with the external environment, whether in real life we might think of it as internal, like the lungs. Okay, so I'm going to do a little bit of drawing as we do this. So I've left this space blank so that we can basically redraw the sections of the body as we think about them. So when we're thinking about environments, we're basically thinking about an external environment. So that's external to the body. So like outside your skin. And we're going to think about the internal environment. So the internal environment is what most of your cells are going to be in communication with. Most cells aren't touching air. They're touching like interstitial fluid. So we'll get to that internal environment in a second. Okay, so when we have the external environment, we're thinking about this epithelial layer. So we have our skin here. So we saw our skin that was the outside of the tube. So I'm drawing the epithelial layer. But that epithelial layer, that border of the external environment, also coats the inside of the lungs. So when air comes into your body, that air that comes into the lungs is continuous with the external environment. So it's going to have all the same components in roughly the same concentration as the air outside your body. So that's still an external environment. Same thing with your gut tube, actually. So the things that you swallow, they haven't really reached equilibrium with anything in the body yet. So that's still an external environment, the food traveling through your gut tube. So we'll see, we also have an epithelial layer bounding the gut lumen, so separating that from the rest of the body. So that's important to note. We'll get to the GI tract in A&P2 and discuss how we get those components into the other compartments. So when we're drawing this body schematic, it's basically going to be just like a bag of bags. So think about like a trash bag where you hold all your other shopping bags. We're going to have components inside the body that are separated from each other as well. So I'm going to progress the slides. So I'm going to leave that drawing up as we start to talk about the internal environment. So the internal environment is going to be what most of the cells in your body are touching. So there is going to be fluid inside your body. Your body is at least 60% water, basically. And there's a lot of fluid. So there's fluid surrounding your tissues, and there's a lot of fluid in your blood. There's also fluid in your bladder related to your GI tract. That's really going to be one of the sort of first places that fluid goes, but it gets into the rest of the body. Okay, so when we're thinking about fluid inside the body, that's really our internal environment. That's going to be the environment that's the setting for our cells and their functions. So we have tissue fluids, which we call interstitial fluids. So not all the fluid is inside a cell. Our cells have a nice, neat little membrane. They're their own little bag. But surrounding that little bag, that's the cell, we have fluid that's the environment of that cell. Most of this is called interstitial fluid. So fluid surrounding your muscle cells, for example, that's interstitial fluid. But we have some specialized fluid that's slightly different in composition in the blood. So as we draw our little diagram, we want to draw our circulatory system separately, because this thing that we call plasma is a little different than our interstitial fluid. So when we're thinking about the internal environment and its fluid, we're going to think of two separate components. We're going to think about the fluid inside the blood, and then all the other fluids surrounding all our other types of tissues. So we're going to need a circulatory system on here. Okay. Maybe I should get a better pen than my mouse. But you get the rough idea that are drawn in the actual figure. Okay.
Can I ask a question about
Absolutely.
the epithelial cells? Are there different types of epithelial cells too? Because it seems like the different areas would need like membranes and things and to do different purposes.
Yeah, there totally are different types of cells in that external layer. So for example, you sweat, right? So there will be glandular cells in there as well. There will be cells specialized for excretion, secretion. But when we're thinking about the border of the body, they're really all sort of grouped together under this main term. Okay. That's a good question. I'm gonna turn off this tool. Okay. So after we have this schematic, we want to think about that external to internal exchange. So we want to get things from our external environment, so like the air. We want to pull in certain things all the way into our body, into our circulatory system, so that it can be spread around to the rest of our cells. So it needs to get into the plasma. Specifically, things we really want to get in there are things like oxygen. All your cells need oxygen to produce ATP to survive. It's really important. So we have to get it all the way into the blood. After it gets into the circulatory system, into the plasma, it's then going to go out to the rest of your tissues. So it's going to go from the plasma into our interstitial fluid and ultimately into our cells. So that's how stuff is moving from the external environment of the body all the way into our deepest layer, into the cells, which is where we'll be thinking about a lot of the exchanges in physiology. Different things move in the other direction as well. So specifically wastes are going to be moving just this opposite pathway out of the cell into the fluids around the tissues. Then they're going to get scooped up by the plasma in the circulatory system, and ultimately they'll be communicated to the external environment, whether that's through the GI tract or through urination, or potentially through breathing, depending what we're talking about. If we're talking about CO2, for example, you'd breathe that out. So each of these pieces of the communication system has a different term. So we have absorption, so that's moving here in this place from the external into the body. We have absorption, so we can see that little arrow here from our gut tube into our plasma. If we talk about the reverse, from the plasma to the external environment, we're talking about secretion. We'll also have some more specialized terms that'll become important as we talk about really the GI system and excretion in general, which is in A and P2. But we also have filtration, so we have things move from our circulatory system, this compartment containing plasma, into our kidneys and into our urinary tract. We'll also have reabsorption here, so we may filter certain things out, like we'll filter out some water, but we then may reabsorb it back into the body. And we'll see why that process is important as we get into the nitty-gritty when we do that organ system. Okay. We want to think about the locations where this exchange is happening between the external environment and the internal environment. So we're basically thinking about these basic compartments when we think about that exchange. We're going to have exchange between the blood and the external environment. And this will happen when the blood and the external environment are in close contact. So specifically in the lungs, we have very close contact. In the GI tract and in the kidneys, we'll see that we have capillary systems pressed up right against the external epithelial layer in these locations. Then we'll have additional specialized mechanisms happening basically in the GI tract and the kidneys. So that's where our absorption, so into the body, and secretion out of the body are happening, as well as some specialized function of the kidneys, filtration, moving from the blood into the kidneys, reabsorption, moving from the urinary tract into the blood, and secretion, just like in the GI tract, moving from the blood to the external environment. We'll talk about each of those specialized terms as they become relevant. So right now we want to think about those compartments containing different body fluids. And the reason we want to think about that is that they're going to have slightly different properties. They're going to have different amounts of, for example, proteins dissolved in them that are going to make them behave slightly differently when we talk about them and their functions within our organ systems. So we can divide the body into some rough compartments, and each of those compartments is going to contain some type of fluid that may be slightly different. These compartments are also separated by epithelial membranes. So it's not just that we have a layer of tissue separating outside from inside, external from internal on the outside of the body as the skin. We also have these compartments surrounded by epithelial tissue inside the body. And these membranes are semi-permeable, so they are going to allow things to cross. If we're talking about all the fluid in the body, so we don't care whether it's your interstitial fluid, we don't care if it's in your blood, we just want to think about all the body water, everything inside your human organism. We call it total body water, TBW. So total body water will be important as you think about things like dehydration, right? You want to maintain a certain level of total body water in your body and especially in your blood. But because we're talking about different organ systems and different types of tissues, we also want to sort of break down that total body water into a few different types. So we're not going to break it down by all our named systems. We're going to divide it basically into our circulatory system versus everything else. So we have water and dissolved materials in our total body water. There will be different solutions in our cells and surrounding those cells. So as we start to break down total body water, here we go. We're going to have subdivisions of that body water. And that's what we see highlighted here in this image. So when we're looking at these images, the part in blue is the fluid we're talking about. So we can start to think of this as a tree if we're thinking about our divisions of total body water. So at this point, we're just dividing our total body water into two parts. We're dividing it into fluid inside cells. That's our intracellular fluid. And we're dividing it into our fluid outside of cells. That's our extracellular fluid. So you can see here in the image, you can see our intracellular fluid is going to include all the fluid in the red blood cells in our circulatory system, because those are cells drawn onto this diagram, and also in the cells in our various tissues. So we haven't drawn out each and every type of tissue. We haven't drawn out all the muscles. We haven't drawn the brain. We've just drawn a general block of cells to represent all the different types of tissues in the body. But all the cells in all those different types of tissues is going to include water. So here we have our division between our intracellular fluid and our extracellular fluid. So when we're thinking about our intracellular fluid, that fluid specifically is going to be in the cytoplasm of the cells. And we are going to abbreviate it as we talk about it, the ICF. So when you see your textbook refer to ICF, it's talking about intracellular fluid, it's talking about fluid inside a cell, it's talking about fluid in the cytoplasm of that cell. So if you see fluid surrounding your various organelles, some fluid around the mitochondria, we're talking about intracellular fluid. So that's really the deepest layer we can go, all the way inside the body, all the way inside a cell. The environment that cell is in is our extracellular fluid. So that cell with its cytoplasm has its membrane separated from an environment, but that environment isn't some random field. That environment is the inside of your body. That environment is the fluid that's inside your body, but not inside a cell. So that's our extracellular fluid. And we refer to the extracellular fluid as the internal environment. We'll talk about that in a second, but it's the internal environment surrounding each of these cells. But we're not done once we get our division between intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid, because we have two special kinds of extracellular fluid. So this intracellular component is basically done. We have our cytoplasm inside our cell, but when we get to extracellular fluid, we want to be a little more specific. So when we're thinking about our extracellular fluid, we want to think about whether that fluid is in the blood or whether it's out between your muscles somewhere. That's going to be important to its composition, and that's going to be important to what it's carrying within it. Okay. So when we're thinking about our internal environment, the extracellular fluid, we're going to zoom in on this part. Okay. So 40% of your body weight is included in the intracellular fluid. So about half of the water in your body is going to be inside some cell somewhere. And then when we're thinking about extracellular fluid, that this 20% of body weight, so the other part of the water in your body, we're splitting that between the plasma, which is the fluid in your blood, and the fluid that's just generally surrounding cells, but it's not in the circulatory system. That's your interstitial fluid. We're going to abbreviate that ISF. Okay, so we can think about that in terms of volume as well. So if we look here at this table on the right, we can see the body fluids broken down by volume. So 70 kilogram male is what every textbook uses as your base human, whether that's fair or not, you be the judge, but that's what we're going to be thinking about as the baseline as we think about these volumes. So for a 70 kilogram male, about 60% of his body weight is water. So we have a total body water weight of 42 liters. Okay. Now, how much body water you have will depend on whether you are male or female. It'll depend on how old you are. It'll depend actually on your body composition as well. Muscle and fat hold different amounts of water, but should be somewhere around here. This is a typical range. So I have about 42 liters of water inside your body. And of that 42 liters, 28 of those liters are inside a cell somewhere, and 14 are inside the extracellular fluid. So the other 14 liters are just kind of floating around. So you'll see that 28 and 14 together add up to 42. So we almost might want to draw a line here under ECF, because ICF and ECF are the first two divisions of our total body water. But of those 14 liters of water that constitute our extracellular fluid, we subdivide those further to water in the blood, which we call plasma, and interstitial fluid, which is out in the tissues, but not in blood itself, just kind of between tissues. We have 11 liters of that, so we can see that 11 and 3 add up to 14. So we've subdivided the extracellular fluid here. These will both count as part of our internal environment for cells, because some of our cells, like our red blood cells, are in the plasma. some of our cells are embedded in the interstitial fluid. Questions about these sort of different subdivisions of body fluid. So as you're reading through your textbook, you may have noticed that they have a couple sort of thinking questions, and these are exercises for you to test that you understand what we've been talking about in lecture and what you've read. So I encourage you to actually do the checkpoint questions, but we're going to use a couple of them as discussion prompts in class. So we're going to start with this first set of checkpoint questions. I'm going to send you to your breakout rooms for a second, and you're going to start talking about the extracellular fluid. And I want you to think about why it's called extracellular, extra meaning outside, when it's actually the body's internal environment. Like, why do we name it that way? So anybody want to share with me their answer for why we call the extracellular fluid the internal environment?
I just said it's extracellular because it's outside the cells, but it's part of the internal environment because it's still located within the body.
Perfect, Kylie. Yeah, that's right. So it's a bit of a handle on these different components of the body. We're going to talk about homeostasis. So your body manages to keep all sorts of things constant day after day after day after day, no matter what you eat, no matter how hard you're running, no matter how hot it gets outside, no matter how cold it gets outside. And this is actually a pretty impressive feat. We have a lot of variable conditions in our environment, but our cells still manage to function. And that's because they can manage to maintain some really critical things the same in the internal environment. Okay, so this is key to understanding how our body manages to have similar functions in different conditions. So your body can maintain this consistent internal environment in terms of a number of sort of set points for regulated variables. Now, we don't regulate everything in the body. We regulate things that are really important to cellular function. So temperature is one of those things. It's a really important one because different proteins function differently at different temperatures. So if we were to change the temperature in the internal environment too drastically, this would really change chemical reactions going on in cells. It would mess with the function of all sorts of different organ systems. We're also going to be carefully regulating the volume of fluid. So our internal environment really is our extracellular fluid. So we want to make sure that we maintain that fluid volume, that we maintain enough water surrounding our cells, that they're able to communicate with the outside of the cell. And we're also going to be regulating composition. So we're going to have certain chemicals that we want to have at certain set compositions, set concentrations. And that's going to be really important to how our cells, for example, signal to each other as they slightly vary the composition of the surroundings of the cells. So this requires our organ systems to work together. Basically, you can't do it with just one organ system. So if we think about the volume of our internal environment, so the volume of the extracellular fluid, we need, for example, our GI system working in concert with our circulatory system to spread out the water we're drinking. So we're going to have to muster different organ systems in order to keep these different variables under control. When homeostasis gets disrupted, this causes disease, this causes death. If we have the wrong composition of some key ions, basically, for example, our nervous system will stop working because we won't be able to signal from one nerve to a muscle. So we need to maintain these internal conditions. And we're going to do this using something called feedback loops. And really, when we're talking about homeostasis, we're going to be talking about something called a negative feedback loop. We'll see that positive feedback loops also do exist, but their role isn't to maintain homeostasis. Their role is going to be in specialized functions of the body. So when we're thinking about negative feedback, we're also going to be talking about something called an error signal. So homeostasis, right? We're maintaining key conditions the same. But you can't actually never have any variation whatsoever. The body isn't magic. We're going to have slight fluctuations from our regulated variable set point. So we can think about this, an analogy in real life, as like the cruise control system on your car. So you set cruise control to 60 miles per hour, and it's trying to keep you at 60, but the external conditions to your car are going to vary. So say you're in your car. I live halfway up the hill. So say I'm at the bottom of the hill. I set my cruise control to 60 miles per hour as I'm cruising down the highway coming home. Okay, so I'm at 60, everything's flat, everything's fine, but then I want to go up my incline. So as I start to progress forward, so as we start to move up this hill, our external conditions change. So now that my car is trying to go uphill, I have a new problem, right? Which is that gravity is going to pull me back down the hill. So in order to keep going, I'm going to need to make some changes. I can't keep using that same amount of gas going up the hill, because as I do, we'll see as I hit the hill, I'm going to slow down because I'm just giving it the same amount of gas, but now we have this force pulling me backwards. So it's going to pull my speed down. But I have my cruise control on, so I want to stay at the same speed. That's the whole point of the cruise control. So as I start to go up this hill, my cruise control is going to give the car a little more gas, give it a little more oomph. And even though gravity is still pulling me down as I continue to go up the hill, my speed is going to slowly start climbing, right? So I'll give it a little gas, it'll push me up to 58. And then even though I'm still going up the hill, my cruise control knows about it now. So it's going to give it a little more gas. And we're going to get up to 60. So we're going to be back to that set point that I said at the beginning as I was on this flat ground, even though we're now under a new condition. Now we're going up the hill. We have gravity pulling us down in this car. So in order to maintain this 60 miles per hour, we needed to make a little bit of a change. And this is what's happening in your body as well as you're trying to maintain homeostasis. So your body is going to take note of the fact that our conditions have changed. And the way that it finds that out, actually, is it's going to note this change in this regulated variable. So I'm going to clear my drawings here. And we're going to take a look at basically what our body would be sensing under conditions like this, continuing to use this sort of analogy of a car going up a hill. So as we start to climb this hill, right? So we're setting out at 60 miles per hour. Everything's well and good. That's what our cruise control is set at. And then we hit the hill. As we hit the hill, we slow down because of gravity pulling us backwards. We have this new force. Our external conditions have changed. And so it pulls us down a little bit, pulls us down to 55 miles per hour. Now, your cruise control can't actually sense gravity, right? And your body is also not going to necessarily be magically intuiting what the outside temperature is. What your body is able to tell is going to be your internal temperature, which is going to drop a little bit if we're talking about temperature regulation. So your body is going to note this, and it's going to sense a discrepancy between where it wants our set variable to be and where it actually is. So we call this our error signal, is your body sensing that this regulated variable has moved away from its set point. Your body is then going to take that signal and it's going to do something about it. So it's going to take that signal in, it's going to feed it into something that we call an integration center. So basically you'll have a portion of your brain devoted to registering that signal and mustering a response in the organ systems of your body to fix it. So as we register this error signal, your brain is going to eventually pick this up and it's going to start telling different parts of your body to adjust. So here we're going to see that we're sending out an adjustment, right? So this car is gassing it up a little more, and your body will have similar mechanisms using effector organs to maintain homeostasis to get you back to this set point. Okay. So I keep using these terms, but I'm going to write them out here. So when we're talking about homeostasis, we have regulated variables. So those are the things that your body is trying to control. So you have, in this example, it's the speed of a car, but when we're talking about homeostasis, we're thinking about temperature, we're thinking about volume of the extracellular fluid. Maintaining blood glucose concentration is also really important. Your cells need glucose to produce energy, so that would be a regulated variable. Blood pH and plasma levels of sodium are also very tightly regulated. So our regulated variable is what we're controlling, and the set point is our expected value. So our set point is where we want it. So a set point for your core body temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, but 37 degrees Celsius. Your set point for blood glucose is 100 milligrams per deciliter. Your set point for blood pH is 7.4. So that's what we would write here on the y-axis if we were talking about regulating one of these homeostatically controlled variables, one of these regulated variables. Okay. All the various things that the body does to bring that regulated variable back down to its set point are functioning via something called negative feedback. So here we have the example of blood glucose. We're trying to keep it at 100. Just like with the car changing speed, our blood glucose here is increasing, so we register an error signal. Okay, so we have this error signal. We want to bring that back down. We want to get rid of this error signal. We want to get back down to our set point. And this is called negative feedback. So as this regulated variable increases, we don't want that. So via negative feedback, we pull it back down. It can happen in the other direction as well. So when we were looking at that car, our speed dropped, we brought it back up. That's still negative feedback. We call it negative feedback if the response of the system is the opposite direction to that error signal, to that change that we're sensing. So it's negative feedback if something in your body starts changing and then your brain goes, no, 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 put it back the way it was. That's negative feedback. Okay. In the body, we have our various structures that enable this negative feedback, enable your body to sense these changes, enable you to adjust these regulated variables. And this is where we're gonna pick up on Monday. Okay, so I'm gonna pause now. On Blackboard, you'll see that there was an assignment about a final question that we were going to go over. I'm going to delete that assignment because we didn't get there. So for the weekend, your assignment is just going to be to go through a quiz. So there will be 3 questions based on the material we got through today. I did open the quiz yesterday, but I'm gonna go check right now to make sure that we got through all the questions. any questions about what we covered so far? What I want you to be focusing on thinking about as you prepare for Monday is really this idea of negative feedback, because negative feedback is going to be key really to how all our organ systems are functioning. So for all our organ systems, we're going to see some variable that changes as we send some type of signal as our body does something, and that gets pulled back down. So this idea of negative feedback is really important to understand.